je veux simplement vous souhaiter la bienvenue à l'Université d'Ottawa pour ce colloque annuel du laboratoire de recherche interdisciplinaire sur les droits de l'enfant. Le laboratoire, comme vous le savez sans doute, regroupe des professeurs, des chercheurs et des étudiants de plusieurs facultés, de plusieurs disciplines et en fait aussi de plusieurs universités de la région, je devrais dire. C'est un modèle, je crois, de collaboration entre professeurs de plusieurs disciplines autour d'un même thème, celui des droits de l'enfant. C'est un thème qui est d'actualité, qui est particulièrement important. Et la preuve en est que à chaque année, le laboratoire organise un colloque comme celui-ci sur un thème qui est toujours très attrayant, très couru et très important. Et le thème de cette année est justement une illustration de ça, c'est la prévention de la violence à l'école par les stratégies reliées aux droits de l'enfant. Quel problème, en fait, nous touche plus que celui-là, la question de la violence et de l'intimidation à l'école comme enfant, comme parent? C'est un problème auquel à peu près tout le monde a dû être confronté ou sera confronté un jour ou l'autre. Et il est donc tout à fait nécessaire et utile qu'on réfléchisse à des solutions et qu'on réfléchisse à la contribution du concept de droit et de droit de l'enfant à la résolution de ce problème-là. Et le programme du colloque je pense, nous donne un bel exemple de ce que devrait être la recherche en milieu universitaire, puisque vous y trouvez à la fois des contributions d'organismes et de gens qui sont dans la communauté, qui sont sur le terrain à tenter de trouver des solutions à ces problèmes-là, des contributions de chercheurs universitaires qui emploient des méthodes scientifiques pour tenter de jeter un nouvel éclairage sur la problématique de la violence et de l'intimidation. Et aussi, il y aura, je crois, cet après-midi, un atelier sur l'évaluation des stratégies. Donc, ce n'est pas simplement de faire des propositions en l'air, mais c'est de voir vraiment qu'est-ce qui fonctionne et qu'est-ce qui ne fonctionne pas. Et à cet égard-là, tant par son aspect interdisciplinaire que par son aspect partenarial, je pense que la conférence d'aujourd'hui donne un bel exemple de ce que devrait être la recherche universitaire. Alors, je n'en dis pas davantage. Il y a des gens qui en connaissent bien plus que moi qui vont vous parler. Alors, je fais simplement vous souhaiter la bienvenue et vous souhaiter un bon colloque. Merci beaucoup.
So, before starting, j'aimerais remercier d'abord la Fondation du droit de l'Ontario pour son appui financier pour cet événement. Aussi, le Centre de recherche et d'enseignement sur les droits de la personne de l'université qui nous appuie aussi avec l'organisation de cet événement. So that's the Human Rights Research and Education Center that is also helping us with organizing this event. And they're in charge of organizing social media, as you can see here on the board. And I'd like to thank Michelle Phillips and her social media team who are here today and who will be posting pictures and texts on Facebook and tweeting live. And they're really encouraging you to participate in this, so to use the LRIDE, LRID hashtag to tweeting, go on the Human Rights Research and Education Center Facebook page and participate in this. At the same time, I'd also like to say, just make sure that everybody is aware of this, that the event will be recorded, so there is a camera there. So if you're staying here, that means that you're consenting to being recorded during this event. Donc voilà, donc les bénévoles vont afficher des articles et des photos sur la page Facebook du Centre des droits de la personne et vont tweeter en temps réel au hashtag LRID. Et donc on vous encourage de participer à ces médias sociaux, donc à ces plateformes, pour donner une toute autre dimension à cet événement, à cette conférence aujourd'hui. Les présentations vont être, comme vous le savez, en français ou en anglais, donc il n'y a pas de traduction simultanée. However, for questions, my co-chair, Tara Collins from Ryerson, who's here, and I are certainly happy to help with translating questions and answers if that's helpful to you. There are some changes to the first panel, the 10:30 panel. We've unfortunately had some people sick, injured, losses in the family, etc. And so this is already reflected in the final program. Steve Ashby from Plan Canada won't be able to come because of a loss in his family. I just heard this morning that Michel Côté from l'Alternative Outaouais is sick today, and Valerie Steeves, who was going to be chairing, has injured her leg, and so Tara has kindly accepted to chair that panel as well. Donc voilà des changements au programme. Valerie Steeves ne va pas pouvoir présider la séance, et Michel Côté de l'Alternative Outaouais est malade aujourd'hui, donc il ne pourra pas être là. So we'll start now right away. We'll start with the conference with our keynote speaker, Professor Wayne McKay, who's from Dalhousie University School of Law. Professor McKay has an impressive career and impressive achievements, as you can probably see in his bio in your folders, and I will only highlight some of those. He's been a law professor for over 30 years, and he's worked as a legal expert and also administrator in many capacities. He was president and vice chancellor of Mount Allison University. He has served as executive director of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, and he's also sat as a tribunal member there and also on the Canadian Human Rights Commission. He's recognized as an expert on human rights codes, charter rights, education law, cyberbullying, and he's written several books and over 100 articles, as well as served as an advisor and legal consultant on these matters. Among others, he's conducted a review of inclusive education in New Brunswick, and presented a report to the government on reforming education in that province. More recently, he chaired the Nova Scotia Task Force on Bullying and Cyberbullying and wrote the report. And he now chairs St. Mary's University's Presidential Council on Preventing Sexual Violence and Promoting Respect on Campus. So all very relevant matters to today's conference topic. Professor McKay has won numerous prizes, awards, and honors for his achievements, and I will just note that in 2005, he was appointed member of the Order of Canada. So it's a great honor for us that he accepted our invitation, and we'll now invite him to deliver his keynote address.
Thank you very much. Bonjour. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the kind introduction. And I'm happy to be here, even though it did require a bit of a temperature adjustment. When I left Halifax, it was plus 13, and the taxi driver tells me it's minus 27 here this morning. So if I'm a little frozen, that may explain it. So, well, we're here as an interdisciplinary group, which is excellent, I think, as a way to talk about these large challenges of bullying and cyberbullying and those kinds of things. And I look forward to our discussion and question, and I know I've got excellent panelists to pick up on some of my themes. And I'll ask my organizers to kind of keep me on track as far as time. I'll try to stay within that, but it's a large topic, and I'll do my best. So the title is Effectively Responding to Bullying and Cyberbullying. There's no app for that. And that's part of sort of a second part of my title from the Nova Scotia Task Force that Mona referred to. And if I do say so myself, one of those rare moments of some cleverness. Academic struggle for that as they aged. At least they think they're clever. They often aren't, as most of you students know, but they think they are. Anyway, this did occur to me as like a kind of a useful title, given the topic, that obviously there's no simple solution, and we have apps for everything, it seems, these days, but there really is not an app for respectful and responsible relationships. Of course, I immediately got all kinds of tech people who said, "Of course, there's an app for cyberbullying. We've got it," but they didn't really read the title. There might even be an app for cyberbullying, but there's not really an app, I don't think, for respectful and responsible relationships, which is the other part of that. So anyway, that's the title. Okay. An audience like this, I probably don't really need to make the point, but bullying and cyberbullying is a form of violent expression and behavior and has very negative consequences. And as the little quote, which you probably can't read there with the young man, is that words hurt, that the sticks and stones will break my bones is not correct. It will break your bones or break your spirit anyway. And one of the early questions that I wanted to raise, at least, is the terminology. And in some of the studies we did, whether bullying as a term is too soft a term. And it's interesting, as I'll indicate, I've also recently chaired the St. Mary's Council or Task Force on Sexual Violence. And similar to the debate that's currently going on about whether we should reclaim the more sort of a negative term of rape as opposed to non-consensual sex or sexual violence. And there was a piece in the paper not long ago, I think, on that point. Similarly, on bullying, maybe it's too soft a term. You know, kids will be kids. They're just roughhousing. He'll learn to take his knocks, that sort of thing. Whereas the Senate committee and any study of this finds that it's a really serious matter. The Senate study, which is a very impressive one I recommend for anyone studying on this, cyberbullying hurts respect for rights in the digital age. So anyway, that's the first point. It's significant. Our leader, Prime Minister Harper, agrees with me on this. Prime Minister Harper and I don't agree on everything, but this is one that we do. And I'll leave the political commentary, whether there's any irony in him talking about bullying, but I'll just kind of leave that to the audience to make their own conclusions. So he starts off by saying, well, he says, I think got to stop using the term bullying to describe some of these things. Bullying to me has a connotation of kind of kids misbehaving. What we're dealing with in some of these circumstances is simply criminal activity. And of course, they've now, as I'll touch on later, acted on that in part with amendments to the criminal code. So I think the terminology point is significant. Whoops. Now, I hesitated to put this slide up, but I was struck, and one of the interesting questions, this is about the killing and dismembering and feeding to the lions of the giraffe in the Copenhagen Zoo. And one of the interesting, kind of disturbing, I think, things about that is that they had a significant child audience for that. And at least according to some newspaper accounts of that, pretty appreciative and sort of positive audience, although they don't particularly look that way in these pictures, but at least some accounts were saying that, you know, children like this kind of violence, or at least there's an article, more or less, I think in the Globe, that, I forget who it was, in the cover page saying that, you know, we have to come to terms with the fact that kids aren't really these nice fuzzy creatures. They actually like violence, and we have to do something about that. Now I'm oversimplifying, but I think it's a comment as well on the impact of social media that these kind of things happen. So anyway, just one of those things to wake you up. Whoops. This is very sensitive. Okay, so defining what we mean by bullying and cyberbullying is obviously important, and there's different definitions, but the one that we use, not the only one by any means in the task force, is that bullying is typically a repeated behavior. And we didn't go with the more common view that it is repeated, in the sense that there may occasionally be a case where single incidents with long-term impacts might be bullying or cyberbullying, but typically repeated, intended to cause or should be known to cause fear, intimidation, humiliation, and so on. Important that it's not a defense to say that you didn't intend to do it, or it was just a joke, or I didn't mean anything by it. And actually, in that regard, and we're not novel in the task force, drawing on the experience with sexual harassment, that it's new or ought to have known that it was problematic. So there is that sort of added burden, as there should be. And one way of looking at that, and we had big debates on this in the task force, it's looking at it more from the perspective of the victim than the perspective of the perpetrator. It's not whether or not the perpetrator had an evil mind about this, but what's the impact on the victim. So if you knew or ought to have known, that's sufficient. Can be direct or indirect. we went with the Canadian position that cyberbullying is really a subset of bullying. There are some American academics that say they're sufficiently different that they're really separate concepts. I don't think that's true, and that seems to be the Canadian, and I think more the international approach. And that cyberbullying really is simply bullying by electronic or digital means. Now, having said simply, the impact is so much greater because of its pervasiveness and its permanence and anonymity, all those kind of things. Now, one little paragraph that got left off here, we also had a final little line saying that, and this has been adopted in the Education Act in Nova Scotia and the Cyber Safety Act, that a person who encourages or assists bullying is also a cyberbully or a bully. So one of the, looking at the important impact that all the studies talk about of the bystanders or hitting the like button when somebody's making a negative comment, that in Nova Scotia, and I think maybe a few others now, but not very many, the bystander, the encouraging or assisting bystander. We didn't go so far as to put an obligation on the bystander to intervene, sort of the Good Samaritan rule for any of you with a law background. But it does say if you assist or encourage, and what does that mean? You know, what about internet service providers that facilitate and so on? Anyway, one could have great debates about that, but that is there as well. Again, on impact, and these are just a few examples of some of the high-profile victims, people who died by suicide, in part linked to bullying and cyberbullying. It's always a great debate. It's not a cause and effect kind of thing, but certainly, and there was some recent study talked about in the Globe just a couple of days ago, that there's now more evidence linking issues of bullying and cyberbullying to suicides, or at least risk factors for suicides, including 2 to 3 times as likely if they had been bullied or cyberbullied. So it's not a direct link, but I think this just reminds us of the human face of not properly responding to bullying and cyberbullying. So the scope and consequences, if I got the right slide, I do, of bullying and cyberbullying. And on this, obviously, the suicides we just talked about, but that's fairly extreme. Physical, emotional injury, personal health, depression, headaches, eating disorders, all kinds of things. Lots of studies at how significant this is and how long-term. Also, more and more studies all the time that these tend to be long-term, sometimes lifelong impacts. And I think the more we study about this, the more problematic it seems. And I know when I was chairing and dealing with the task force, people of all ages would come up to me and gyms and grocery stores or anywhere else I happen to be and talk about their experiences with bullying and cyberbullying. And I'd have 70 or 80-year-old people coming up and talking as if it was yesterday about how they were bullied at school. So they have long-term impacts for sure. As I mentioned earlier, suicides are only one of the most extreme and not a direct cause and effect. But there does seem to be some correlation, and I'm sure that's something we're going to look more at as time goes on. The dimensions of bullying as a problem and cyberbullying and why it is so hard to deal with, I think, is in part is that it's really about relationships. It's a relational problem, and it has human rights dimensions. So again, as the title of our task force says, it's respectful and responsible relationship. There's no app for that. We really have to look at the relationships. It's not just individuals, not just identifying who the bullies are and sending them off to some Siberian prison or something like that. It's a much more complex thing than that. Although maybe Ottawa is kind of Siberian today, but in any event, that it's a more complicated relational kind of thing, and that's harder to deal with. All right, so the other comment, it's a symptom of a deeper problem. And we didn't get too far into the task force work to discover that really the core issues were not so much bullying and cyberbullying, although that was there. It really is a symptom of much greater problems about how we interact with each other. As the quote says, adult behavior, this is from the task force, and adult role models play a significant role in bullying and cyberbullying. Too often the adults in the families, schools, and broader communities within which our children grow and develop have failed to nurture in them attitudes and skills essential to a civil society, that is compassion and responsibility. And again, lots and lots of studies emphasizing the concerns about lack of empathy, those kinds of things. And that's why, again, it's such a challenging topic. This, again, having given Prime Minister Harper a bit of a positive nod on bullying, I'll take a little shot at him now just to show how balanced I am. Part of the problem, as indicated, is role models. And the thing in the left, it's very small to see, the cartoon, is him plotting with others for some attack ads on Justin Trudeau, and the mother walking by with her kids saying adult role models are really critical in all of this. So is that the kind of role model? Whether or not that's bullying or cyberbullying is a whole other issue, but it's certainly not necessarily a role model that you'd want to follow. And the one on the right, a little more dated in terms of the role models of people and how they behave as adults are then picked up by kids who's then bullying his cat, having been seeing all these adults in his life bully people and so on. And it's a bit simplistic, but not totally wrong. And I haven't got the defamation lawsuit yet, but in the task force, I sort of singled out Don Cherry as somebody who's done fairly well by bullying and Hockey Night in Canada, and maybe Kevin O'Leary on Dragon's Den, and the list could go on and on. But that we have lots of role models which are not exactly models of compassion and responsibility. I think just another footnote to that, important to, I think, link into the adult part, because sometimes I think there's kind of a perception that this is a young problem, this is a youth problem only, that this is something that's a problem, and it is that, but it's not only that, it's a much larger problem. And one of the challenges as well is the interchangeable roles that the perpetrator, the bystander, the victim kind of morph into each other, and that's what the Senate report comments on in our task force, that people who at one point in their life are victims then may bully somebody else, not unlike cycles of domestic violence where kids who have been abused grow up to be abusive husbands, and mostly husbands and wives, but mostly husbands and so on, that they, and the bystanders as well. So there's no absolute clear categories that the victim, the bystander, and the predator, the bully, can interchange positions depending on the context, which again makes it challenging. Who should be responding? The issue of bullying and cyberbullying cannot be laid exclusively at the doors of homes and schools. Both parents and teachers have vital roles to play and have contributed to the problem. However, it's a broader community problem and many stakeholders. That was a major theme from our task force, that it's a significant social and community problem, and we need a broad-based community response, not just government, not just parents, but all of them in varying degrees. So again, as more graphically, parents, government, teachers, school administrators, justice, community, internet service providers, really interesting issues to think about in terms of the role of the private sector, and Google and Facebook and Bell Canada and Rogers and these people. And we did have on our task force group in Nova Scotia representatives from Bell Canada, and now trying, for good and PR reasons, but it doesn't matter, still good, are interested in trying to do something about these problems. So that's there's many different ways, groups that should respond. Parents as role models. Most parents aren't quite as direct as the little cartoon here, but or the picture here, but says the main message parents get from the media is that in order to keep their teenagers safe online, they must control, monitor, or otherwise micromanage their teens' online behavior. Unfortunately, these behaviors are not effective. This is just one comment. Obviously, people debate that, but that's one of the challenges in terms of parental roles. How do you do this? And in fact, there's so many layers of challenges, not the knowledge of technology and social media. So even if you want to, can you do it? And children are almost always ahead of the adults on that. But also, what's the price of too much micromanagement? And Edward Snowden, I think, not that, again, he's the authority, but was making the comment that younger people will soon have no sense of privacy at all, or maybe they don't now, but to the extent that there's nothing that's really off limits. So the challenges facing parents are huge, and that's particularly a hot topic in Nova Scotia at the moment, because the Cyber Safety Act in Nova Scotia makes parents who do not reasonably supervise their children's online activities, first of all, liable under the Cyber Safety Act as cyberbullies, number one. And number two, they can be sued for money compensation for any damages. So there's a high obligation now in Nova Scotia. Other provinces looking at this as well. But a lot of parents don't really know what is reasonable online supervision. How do you do that? And how do you, what if you don't have the knowledge and ability to do that? So it is a challenge. The other challenge, the helicopter parents, which is this is supposed to represent, right? Says we hold up freedom as this extraordinary value, yet are unwilling to allow young people to explore it. Dana Boyd, and I think that's obviously one of the challenges. A while I have 4 kids, but it's a while since I've been directly immersed in the parenting role. But it's always a challenge to balance the sort of freedom to make their mistakes and learn on their own, and the guidance and direction to sort of get them along what you feel are the correct paths. But in some cases, it's too far on one side, others too far on the other. Ohio had some legislation, I think it involved actually microchipping children that allowed you to follow them and look at all their materials and so on, which has issues. The Cyber Safety Act in Nova Scotia goes, as I said, fairly far in putting high responsibilities. Doesn't do that kind of thing, but there are lots of issues about where do you strike that balance. So anyway, that's one of the many questions. The education system itself, role of teachers, obviously important, and in fact, one of the reasons that the Nova Scotia Task Force was really focused on education, first of all, it arose in the context of a number of suicides, young women dying by suicide connected with cyberbullying. But I think perhaps next to parents, maybe not even next to, schools play a really vital role. And sometimes schools are reluctant to accept that fact, that really they are one of the key players at a very critical time. And one of the reasons that young people are so vulnerable to this, I think, in elementary, junior, and senior high, it's a time when fitting in and being in the group is vital. Nothing is more hurtful than being excluded. So the role of schools is really important. And we have most of our recommendations were focused on that one simple one, which they are following, to have an annual conference dealing not just with issues of bullying and cyberbullying, but linking that to related issues like inclusion and social and emotional learning and other kinds of things. Education systems as well, and health systems more so here, mental and other forms of health. We made a number of recommendations. I won't read through all of that, and I presume the PowerPoint can be available to anybody who wants it, so, or maybe that's automatic, but if not, if you let Mona or everybody else know, you can get a copy of the PowerPoint to look at them in more detail. But one of the areas that we spent quite a bit of time was mental health and the need for better support services in schools, the need for better understanding of risk assessment in terms of the impacts of bullying and cyberbullying, and also the, to the extent one can do this, the risks for suicide. And also a very simple thing, which has happened, to increase the number of guidance counselors and guidance counselors focused on dealing with problems, not just with how do you get into university and fill out resumes and those kind of things, which is important too. But increasingly in most schools, I'd say now there's less human contact. And certainly one of the things that seems a good response to bullying and cyberbullying is more human contact. So, and mental health supports being part of that. How should we respond? There's a host of ways. Whole school and inclusive approach. A lot of cyberbullying and cyberbullying has to do, as I said, with human rights dimensions, excluding people based on the way they look, on their disability, their sexual orientation, their gender, whatever it might be. So I think there's a lot of parallels between good inclusive education and really combating bullying and cyberbullying. Interagency cooperation, not passing the buck from one to the other, proactive interventions, education, obviously, progressive discipline, restorative approaches. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Youth engagement. And that's one of the major, if not the major theme of this conference is youth engagement, that one of the most effective ways based on my research in the task force on this is to involve young people who are on the front lines. They know the problem, but also tend to have a good idea of what the solutions might be, or at least the strategies that are most effective, and supports, and to some extent legal actions, not exclusively that. One way to kind of conceptualize this in terms of responses, and this is a bit simplistic, but is kind of a trinity of responses: education on things like digital citizenship, law and policy, because there is a role for that, and intervention and prevention. And those were kind of the major pillars for the Nova Scotia Task Force dealing with this, to really have responses in all three of those categories. Education and digital citizenship is what I prefer, but others also talk about a different kind of thing. American now PEI academic Perry Aftab says, the more you understand digital and information literacy, the safer you are. Almost a third of cyberbullying cases could be avoided if you used better digital hygiene and thought before we clicked. And that is important, and I don't mean to put down that approach, but sometimes I think our schools get locked in the kind of comparing it to crossing the street, and that's important. You do need to know how to safely cross the street, but I think that's kind of more on the surface, that you also need the deeper, and Perry's not necessarily saying anything different than that, you need the deeper kind of digital citizenship in terms of what is appropriate online conduct. And I'm not sure how well we even do citizenship, digital or otherwise, in our schools anymore, and those education people among us can perhaps tell me that, but certainly in terms of digital citizenship, not very much. And to what extent do issues of respect and what's appropriate and not appropriate get dealt with in the schools in a way that young people can understand? Prevention and intervention, obviously, given the very negative consequences, much more effective and much more important to prevent this rather than responding after the fact. And the challenge is finding effective intervention strategies. When we did the task force, the schools were quite open to this, but found themselves overwhelmed with people that wanted to sell them various programs and strategies and so on as effective prevention mechanisms. In fact, hundreds of them every year. And actually, since I became chair, I get all of these entrepreneurs sending me stuff as well. And the question is, how do you decide what to use? And one of the things, we didn't come up with anointing particular programs out of the task force, but rather created some criteria that would be perhaps useful in deciding what is a good program, such as evidence-based. What's your evidence base that it actually is effective? Engaging the whole community, because I think that's what's needed, provides and allows for more individual supports. You need those. Promote social and emotional learning, and that's huge. In a lot of the studies being done on this, and I'm not by any means an expert on this, Deborah and others know a lot more about this, but I think there's issues around loss of empathy and the fact that our schools don't spend a lot of time on social and emotional learning. And again, which really goes, I think, to the core underlying values and not just the symptoms. And so that needs to be part of it, in my view. Age-specific and appropriate. Also, location appropriate. A lot of American programs, which may be fine, but may need to be adapted to a Canadian context. A form of evaluation, so you can see whether it's working or not, and be cost-effective and sustainable. I mean, there's lots more, but those are all set out in the task force report, and more of them that is online as well. So, law and policy. As a lawyer, obviously, I think that's important, but I don't, as you can tell by the progression of this, I don't think it's the number one thing. I think education and prevention are at least as important as actual law and policy, but I think there's an important role for a law and policy to play in that it does a couple of things that I think are really important. First of all, as I talk about in the report and elsewhere, it's kind of an anchor for the other changes, and it also makes a statement about what's important and what we value in society. And in the task force and other places, I've drawn analogies, for example, to drunk driving. Take the fairly significant change, or domestic violence you could also take, but particularly on matters of drunk driving. Certainly in my lifetime and in a shorter time period, we've had very large changes about whether the extent to which that's regarded as acceptable. And law is one part of that, much more serious consequences and a legal statement that this is a serious crime, but equally important, very extensive media campaigns to convince people that this is not acceptable behavior. And it seems to me that's the same kind of thing that we need in relation to bullying and cyberbullying, that once people conclude that it's not cool, it's illegal, it's not a good thing, then that's important. And I think law plays a significant part in that. Same with domestic violence as well, many other examples. And the last point there, our law should reflect our core values and principles and indicate what we stand for as a society. And in that regard, I think some of the legislation, some of it maybe goes too far, but that the new changes to the Criminal Code, the Cyber Safety Act in Nova Scotia, certainly are making a statement that this is now not acceptable behavior. The legal structure can, of course, both impede and support, but there's various ways that it can help victims find remedies, but you have to operate within a legal structure, and I won't get into any great detail on this, but the provinces have to act within provincial jurisdiction. They can't make criminal laws. That's federal. Lots of charter limitations, as there should be, on protecting the rights of alleged bullies and predators with privacy, freedom from search, free expression, those kind of things. A couple of really positive areas, which I'll just touch on. Human rights. Australia, as one place, spends a lot of time dealing with bullying and cyberbullying issues through human rights structures, because frequently, although not always, the victims are those listed in the Human Rights Code. There is that limit. If they're not, they don't fit. But a lot of them can work, and we recommended, and I think it's starting to happen, a lot of cooperation between the schools and human rights commissions. Lawsuits, defamation, those kinds of things where false Facebook sites are put up, you sue for defamation, not an easy thing, but can be done. And restorative approaches, which is a very sort of relational focus. And in fact, on restorative approaches, just in simplistic terms, I won't read through all of that because I must be getting close to my time here, but I think that the restorative approaches focuses on relations and less individually focused. And in some ways, anything that's new is old at the same time. A lot of restorative approaches is really based on sort of Aboriginal ways of solving problems in terms of the circle and circle sentencing and those kinds of things, reintegrating the offender or alleged offenders back into the community. Doesn't work for all situations by any means, but I think does offer some real promise as a way to respond that's less adversarial, less typically legal, but still within the legal framework. So, and in fact, some of the most promising responses that we saw in Nova Scotia were peer-led restorative approaches, that young people who were heading up and structuring these restorative approaches were having great success in reducing the actual incidence of bullying and cyberbullying. So impediments, lots of impediments. I've sort of touched on that. You have to operate within the Constitution, as you should, in terms of privacy, free speech. I mean, this even violent and unpleasant speech is still free speech up to a point, subject to reasonable limits. Magnitude and complexity of the problem. It's not simple. It's relational, it's complex. The law often can't deal with that kind of complexity, so that's a challenge. Desensitizing impact of technology and social media, and I just throw that out there. Again, not my expertise, but I think one of the core things to think about and study in this whole area is exactly that. What is and what continues to be the real impact of our immersion in social media for young people in particular. There was a piece in the Globe a couple of days ago about some studies of what they were predicting as digital dementia. Just for all of you young people in the room who are on that, just as something to look forward to. But the argument was that, and again, not conclusive, but that there's concerns about the kinds of things and changes that were happening in the brain because of the immersion, some would say over-immersion in social media, which goes back to what do you do as parents and others, and particularly at younger ages. We're not talking so much adults here where people make choices, although that would be true too. But anyway, it does seem to me that. But more importantly, going back to the giraffe and so on, does technology and social media desensitize the anonymous tweets and comments and all these kind of things, the sort of ability to say violent and hurtful things without actually seeing the impact on your victim? What does that do to us as a society? So I think that's huge myself. And more logically or more obviously, accountability and responsibility. Because it's so big, who's really responsible? And in some ways we all are in different ways. But we need some accountability in schools and justice and elsewhere. Okay, Shaheen Sharif, one of many people, but an important writer in this area, comments that really we need to give young people a voice. So this, try to end on a more positive note since I've started with dead giraffes and all kinds of doom and gloom. Let's try to end on a somewhat more positive note, and that fits the theme of the conference, which is that I think the best hope for some effective responses and really doing something about this is really engaging youth and paying attention to some of their thoughts and perspectives on this. In the task force, we had online surveys with 5,000 responses, the majority of which were young people, which in itself is pretty surprising. It took about 40 minutes to fill out this questionnaire online, and whatever 70% of 5,000 students did that, which is pretty amazing in itself. Shows that they were very concerned, but also had youth focus groups in every school district in the province, and specialized youth focus groups on race, Aboriginal origin, disability, sexual orientation, and so on, and got great insights from that. So I agree with Shaheen that really harnessing the energy and insights of youth is our best hope for success. So I guess I've mentioned some of these now. The task force experience UFO restorative approaches, again, led by young people, very important. The idea, as simple as it is, not making bullying not cool. And that's really the key behind the very successful international program now, the Pink Shirt program that originated in Nova Scotia as a way of supporting the victims in bullying and cyberbullying. Once it's not a cool thing to do, not that it's easy to get there, then that's got a major impact on reducing it. And also using social media and technology as a way of combating this. You know, that it's technology and social media is neither good nor bad. It's neutral. It's how we use it. And it can be used, and I think increasingly should be used, as a way of countering bullying and cyberbullying as well. So, one of the unfortunate elements of our progress, and I think there has been some progress on bullying and cyberbullying, is that it's taken some very high-profile tragedies, Amanda Todd, Rehtaeh Parsons, ones like that, to lead not only the justice system, but us as a society towards finally doing something about this. And without perhaps being overly critical of the government, the Rehtaeh Parsons case, and Deborah was involved in this as well, came 1 year after the task force recommendations were out. And not that there's any cause and effect, but if some of the things had happened more quickly, would it have made a difference? And even simple things like the school jurisdiction to deal with discipline simultaneously with criminal, which didn't happen, but now post Rehtaeh Parsons is written into the code and the Education Act and so on. So anyway, I guess it's hopefully part of her legacy. And finally, we're not going to discuss now, we're going to go to panel. We're going to discuss eventually, but one of just, that's supposed to be me. I don't know if it's obvious or not. And the then Minister of Education, because somewhat oddly, I think, politically, when the task force first came out, there was a fair bit of resistance to some of the key recommendations, and rather than, as I think they should have, sort of got on board and said, here we are, we're doing this good thing, let's work to do this, there was actually a lot of resistance, and that got sort of played out, unfortunately for them in the media. She's no longer Minister of Education, I'm still here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Wayne, for sharing your expertise and drawing the links between research you've done on cyberbullying and your knowledge on human rights generally. Non, alors, on ne va pas prendre des questions tout de suite. En fait, nous avons demandé à deux expertes universitaires de préparer de courtes réponses à la présentation du professeur McKay. Et ensuite, les trois pourront interagir un peu ensemble et puis on ouvrira la discussion avec l'audience. Alors, je vais les introduire, je vais leur demander de prendre place ici et je vais les introduire brièvement parce qu'elles vont aussi présenter ensuite cet après-midi. So first we have Professor Deborah Pepler, who's a distinguished research professor at the York University, Faculty of Health at the Department of Psychology, and she leads PrevNet, which perhaps many of you have heard about. It's the Promoting and Eliminating Violence Network, as the network's co-director. Deborah, I will perhaps ask you to say a few words first, and then I'll pass it on to Claire.
Merci. I'm going to speak in English. I'm sorry, but I can answer questions in French. So I first want to say what an honor it is to be here. Mona, merci beaucoup for l'invitation. I'm so excited about the exchanges that can happen today because we're here from a multidisciplinary perspective, standing on a child's rights foundation. So thank you. What a great opportunity. And Wayne, it's really a pleasure to, hear you talk and see the deep dives that you take in understanding these issues. And I am amazed at your ability to stand on your profession of law and move things out so much to an understanding of what we really need to do to support children and youth's healthy development. So in talking today, I thought I'd share with you some of the tensions that I feel, and I really liked your title. There's no app, there's no simple solution to this. It's very, very complex. And so I thought I'd think about this from a child's rights perspective, reflect on what Wayne was saying, and talk about where I see the tensions and where I think we need to do some of the work. Firstly, I'd like to just raise a question about whether we should be using the word bullying. I know that sometimes it's associated with children, but for me, what's unique about bullying that doesn't come through in our discussions of violence or aggression in general is that there's a power differential. And the power over others to control and distress them is such a key feature in what happens in bullying, and the disempowerment of the child or youth who's being bullied is, to me, really important. So I think we have to help Harper understand that it's not just kids sort of quietly misbehaving, but it's children learning how to use power to control and distress others. And that then transfers to other relationships across the lifespan. I think there's a debate between seeing bullying as a crime, and I agree, many of the things that children do when they bully are covered under our criminal code, or seeing society's responsibility to educate children, and certainly children's rights to reach their full potential, to have full education of the whole child, is absolutely critical. And where is the failure if we've not educated a child to understand that these things are wrong? Does the failure reside with parents? Well, if parents don't have those resources, how can they do that? Does it reside with the school? Well, not wholly. I think we need to think about this in a much broader level. And that then brings the question about, is it a law response? And it really helped my thinking, Wayne, when you represented law as showing the values of our society, and I think that's where we're moving positively to say every child, every individual has the right to be safe, and you're not safe when you're being bullied. Conversely, the tension is, well, do we need a legal response or do we need an education and prevention response? A legal response picks up children way downstream. Do we need to be upstream, preventing these problems very early? And preventing, if you think about it, in terms of digital communication, and our children and youth are deeply immersed in this now. In fact, they interact with friends more frequently through electronic means than face-to-face, which, as somebody who's sort of middle age, I find this absolutely unbelievable. But of course, I believe their reports. But our brains aren't designed for this. Our brains have been designed since the beginning of humanity to interact face to face. And so there are neurons in our brains that register people's emotions. Our systems are designed to do that. And digital communication takes that all away. So do we have a much bigger job in educating children and youth to understand how to use this medium, or vice versa? Do they have a big job in helping us understand how to help them? I think that's more the question. There's a right to protect children for sure, but there's also a right to full potential. And I've spent much of my career doing research on aggressive children and their family. And you know, here's where the challenge and the complexity comes in. In a recent study we did on children, aggressive children referred for treatment, 54% of their parents reported that, yes, they bullied others, and they do. I've been on the playground videotaping. I can confirm this. But 84% of parents said that their children had been victimized. And these are children at the margins. These are children whom others don't like because they don't play well with others. And they're at the margins, and they're highly susceptible to victimization. And we as adults would look at those children and when they came in after recess and said they had a really hard time, that somebody bullied them, you can imagine the adult responding with, you know, well, what did you do to them? Because these children have such a strong reputation of being difficult. So the questions of discrimination come in around children at the margins, and it's true, as Wayne mentioned, that in our longitudinal data we can see that some children who are victimized move through and start to bully others, and these are roles that are much more plastic than we'd imagine. I've been working for a number of years with UNICEF's Rights Respecting Schools program, and it goes into schools and tries to embed children's rights in the learning process in the school. It's really a challenge. I think it's exactly where we should go, but it's really a challenge. Schools are hierarchical. Teachers, you know, want to be leaders in their classroom, and yet children have really important perceptions of what's going on and what's needed, and they need to be included in decision making and participation. But we as adults need to come and think about our power and our discomfort with sharing power and what that looks like. So I think we have a long way to go there. I want to put it out. Whose problem is this? Whose problem is bullying? And you know, we can see, especially with Wayne's excellent view of all of the layers of it, that, you know, in some sense it's many people's problems. It's all of our problems, and it's a society problem. And we've had a great opportunity in Canada now since 2006. We've been funded by the federal government to develop a research network, a research funding for a network that bridges science and practice. So PrevNet's the Promoting Relationships and Eliminating Violence Network. Ça marche en français aussi. La promotion des relations saines et l'élimination de la violence. And what we've started to do is learn from each other around what we can do. And what's so interesting is the researchers may have some of the knowledge, but the solutions get affected on the ground. And so the opportunity to really move science into practice can only be done if we bring lots of disciplines together in a day like today and reach out and learn from and work with and co-create with the people who are doing the work on the ground every single day with children and youth. And youth engagement in this process is tremendously important. So first, I'd like to extend an invitation to you if you're interested in joining PrevNet. It's a very inclusive network, and we're heading off. We're on the doorstep of Canada's largest funding, which is really exciting, and it would flow monies into research on children and youth, particularly on bullying prevention and promoting healthy relationships. So you can be in touch with me if you're interested in that. And I want to end by saying we really, really need youth to participate with us when we're moving forward, especially now that the digital age has landed upon us. They're the experts. They truly are the experts in what's happening and what needs to be done. And when I sit and listen to youth, my learning moves so much farther forward. So they're really important partners in our work. And I remember interviewing a young man who said to me, schools need to be a place where we learn to be human. And I think we haven't helped young people do that, and we need to focus on that. So I really appreciated Wayne's framing of bullying as a relationship problem. And research is so clear that the solution to bullying comes through positive and healthy relationships. So if we want to promote children's rights and well-being, it's by grounding them in the kind of relationships that will support their healthy development. So I'm looking forward to many more discussions on this today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Deborah. So, ensuite, je vais demander à la professeure Claire Beaumont de prendre la parole. La professeure Beaumont est psychologue. Elle est professeure à la Faculté des sciences de l'éducation à l'Université Laval et titulaire de la chaire de recherche sur la sécurité et la violence en milieu éducatif. Elle est aussi chercheuse au Centre de recherche et d'intervention sur la réussite scolaire.
Merci. Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Merci beaucoup pour l'invitation. Alors, Deborah s'est excusée d'avoir parlé en anglais tout à l'heure. Alors, je vais m'excuser de parler en français. Alors, on va être... Alors, merci beaucoup, M. McQuaid, pour l'excellente tour d'horizon. Je suis aussi très excitée ou très intéressée à participer avec vous à cette journée parce que je viens du monde de l'éducation, je travaille à la formation des enseignants et je trouve que d'aborder le problème de la violence dans les écoles sous le thème des droits de l'enfant, c'est quelque chose qu'on ne fait peut-être pas assez souvent. Et c'est un thème extrêmement rassembleur parce qu'on revient vraiment à la source. Donc, ce que je vais faire, je vais prendre quelques points. Alors, je suis tout à fait en accord avec ce qui s'est dit ce matin. Et pour ne pas me répéter, et j'ai vraiment très peur, l'angoisse se monte dans mes yeux, je n'ai pas l'heure et j'ai 5 minutes pour faire... Alors, il faudra m'arrêter. Si je m'emballe, vous me le direz, c'est très possible. Alors, je vais prendre 4 points en particulier pour revenir sur les présentations et sur le commentaire de Deborah tout à l'heure. Alors, M. McKay soulignait l'importance d'aborder les droits de l'enfant sous un œil différent, avec des angles différents. Alors, c'est ce que je fais selon mon angle de l'éducation. Il soulevait que c'était un problème social, la violence qui était faite aux enfants, en fait, la violence ou les relations interpersonnelles irrespectueuses. J'ajouterais que c'est un problème social, pas seulement pour les enfants, mais eux, sont vraiment en plus grande vulnérabilité. Ils n'ont pas encore appris des méthodes ou des moyens adéquats pour gérer leurs relations. Et en tant qu'adultes, je pourrais vous dire que très souvent, nous n'y arrivons pas, nous non plus. Alors, ça nous arrive de vivre des situations où les relations sont tendues, nous-mêmes en tant qu'adultes, avec nos amis, avec nos collègues, avec nos familles. La façon dont on réagit sur le coup de l'émotion, c'est pas toujours des modèles qu'on a aussi à démontrer à nos enfants. Alors, le problème est social dans le sens que aussi les enfants qui arrivent dans les écoles arrivent avec un background, ils ont déjà un niveau de développement, des modèles. Et oui, pour les enfants. Et ce que je dis très souvent à mes étudiants, c'est, écoutez, pour vous mettre à la place d'un enfant qui se fait harceler ou qui vit vraiment de l'intimidation ou des violences de ses pairs, vous pouvez très bien revenir sur ce que vous vivez en tant qu'adulte lorsque vous vivez des situations tendues, mais vous êtes un adulte alors que l'enfant est vraiment pas fait les apprentissages sociaux pour pouvoir y réagir. Donc, il est vraiment encore plus vulnérable. Quand on parle d'un autre point, qui doit agir? Alors, qui doit agir pour aider les enfants à développer de meilleures relations, de meilleures façons, que l'enfant soit victime, témoin ou qui agresse encore ses pairs? Bien sûr, les parents ont une force de modèle, mais aussi une force d'éducation très, très importante. On a aussi souligné l'apport des enseignants. Et moi, j'élargirais beaucoup aussi à tous les adultes qui côtoient les enfants, que ce soit dans les équipes sportives, dans les organismes communautaires et tout ça. Je crois qu'on doit vraiment être conscient du devoir et de la force du modèle qu'on peut donner aux enfants. Je vais parler aussi de la formation du personnel scolaire qu'on donne dans les établissements d'enseignement universitaire. On a beaucoup centré la formation sur l'apprentissage des programmes éducatifs, les didactiques, les français, les mathématiques. Le personnel scolaire nous dit actuellement qu'ils ne sont pas formés pour vraiment prendre en charge et accompagner adéquatement les enfants dans les écoles. Certains m'ont dit même qu'ils avaient peur de rempirer le problème s'ils intervenaient. Alors, la formation du personnel scolaire a vraiment un bout de chemin à faire là-dessus. Et je dirais que dans nos facultés d'éducation, les aspects qui sont manquants, beaucoup au niveau de la communication relationnelle, d'établir les liens avec l'enfant, vraiment de rechercher la personne humaine. Oui, tu vas être un enseignant, mais tu es une personne humaine et tu es un adulte qui a le devoir aussi de protection envers un enfant, peu importe la profession qu'il occupe. Qui doit agir aussi? Les témoins, bien entendu. Alors, on a beaucoup mis l'emphase sur les victimes, étant donné la grande souffrance dont on connaît maintenant les effets et les conséquences. Mais je crois qu'on peut aussi dire qui doit agir et comment on doit agir en vraiment misant sur les témoins. Parce qu'il ne faut pas oublier que les témoins, lorsque des scènes d'intimidation ou de violence, les témoins sont en nombre beaucoup plus grand que les victimes ou les personnes qui agressent. Donc, si dans les valeurs des établissements, on véhicule que c'est vraiment quelque chose qui est non acceptable, mais qui n'est même pas valorisé, alors pour se valoriser, certains enfants vont choisir autre chose. Je vais peut-être juste vous mentionner, vous expliquer, résumer une petite recherche que j'ai faite à un moment donné dans une école, où est-ce que c'était une école où c'était que des élèves, des enfants qui avaient des problèmes de comportement importants. Et pendant 2 ans, nous avons travaillé à instaurer des systèmes d'entraide par les pairs. Et oui, même des jeunes qui ont des difficultés de comportement ont été capables d'être des élèves médiateurs, des élèves confidents, d'écouter les confidences de leurs pairs. Et ce que ça a donné, pour illustrer un peu les résultats après 2 ans d'intervention, c'est que dans la cour de récréation, le directeur me dit, écoute, maintenant, quand il y a une bataille dans la cour de l'école, ça se passe plus pareil, parce qu'autrefois, lorsqu'il y avait 2 enfants qui se bataillaient ou qui se chicanaient, il y avait un attroupement et certains prenaient la part de un, certains prenaient la part de l'autre, et l'agresseur, celui qui menait le bal, était vu comme quelqu'un d'important. Il me dit maintenant, lorsqu'il y a une bataille dans la cour de l'école, on voit qu'il y a des jeunes qui s'occupent de séparer les enfants et de calmer les 2 opposants. Il dit, on voit vraiment que les valeurs d'entraide sont passées dans ce milieu-là et que pour pouvoir épater les amis, c'est peut-être plus en passant par l'intimidation, le harcèlement ou la violence. Alors, tout ça pour vous dire qu'on a vraiment une force en éducation, pas seulement les parents ni les enseignants, mais je dirais chaque personne, parce que, comme on l'a très bien dit tout à l'heure, il s'agit d'un problème relationnel. On doit montrer, on a le devoir d'éduquer les enfants. Alors, quand on parle des droits des enfants, bien sûr, ils ont le droit de protection, mais ils ont aussi le droit de se développer, entourés des adultes qui vont les accompagner le mieux possible. Je dirais que les droits des enfants qui agressent les autres sont aussi très souvent bafoués, et c'est inquiétant parce que c'est comme ça qu'on arrive à créer des futurs agresseurs, dans le sens que la punition, la loi, je dirais plutôt la punition, les approches répressives qui sont encore beaucoup en usage dans nos écoles et dans nos maisons, font en sorte qu'on ne va pas nécessairement dans la bonne voie. Alors, ce que je dirais, c'est que oui, il faut mobiliser les témoins, il faut vraiment aider les enfants à réagir lorsqu'ils sont témoins de situations comme ça, mais ils ne le feront pas s'ils sentent que les valeurs du milieu les mettent en danger lorsqu'ils agissent. Alors, il suffit beaucoup plus que de dire aux enfants, mais gars, lève-toi puis dénonce. Parfois, ces enfants-là se mettent en danger parce qu'en le faisant, et c'est pour ça qu'ils nous disent qu'ils ne le font pas, en le faisant, ils mettent leur image en danger eux-mêmes. Alors, on leur dit maintenant, oui, aide quand tu vois un père qui est dans le problème, sauf avant de te lever et de te mettre en danger, assure-toi qu'autour, tu vas avoir des témoins, tu vas avoir des acolytes qui vont te supporter. Sinon, fais-le pas comme ça, va le dire à un adulte. Alors, voyez-vous, il y a des interventions qu'on avait l'habitude de proposer aux enfants. Bon, fais semblant que c'est pas arrivé, ça ne fonctionne pas. OK? Dénonce vivement. L'enfant est en danger. Alors, ce que l'enfant apprend à ce moment-là, c'est ben je l'ai fait et ça s'est retourné contre moi, alors je ne le fais plus. Alors, on doit développer nos façons de mobiliser les témoins sans pour autant les mettre en danger. Et ce que je pourrais dire en terminant, voici l'angoisse qui me prend. Alors, comment agir? Je dirais que la force du modèle est vraiment là, encore une fois. C'est certain que des programmes d'intervention, des interventions ont été réputées plus efficaces que d'autres, mais un adulte qui n'a pas eu de formation demeure quand même un adulte, et s'il est proche, humainement parlant, de l'enfant, il est capable de voir que l'enfant est en souffrance, il est capable de voir que les copains qui rient de cet enfant-là, l'enfant rit, mais que c'est pas vraiment, il trouve pas vraiment la situation comique. Alors, toutes les petites situations qu'on observe, pendant lesquelles on ne fait rien, peut-être qu'on pourrait faire quelque chose. Parce que je crois sincèrement, pour l'avoir expérimenté, parce que j'ai aussi été presque 20 ans en milieu de travail, en milieu scolaire, qu'on peut faire la différence comme adulte dans la trajectoire d'un enfant, qu'il soit victime, qu'il soit témoin ou même qu'il agresse ses pairs. En intervenant, on peut vraiment changer sa trajectoire et être un modèle signifiant. Donc, soyons signifiants pour ces enfants-là. Soyons des modèles, pas des modèles de conduite exemplaire, mais des modèles de résolution de conflits, des modèles pour régler nos différends avec nos amis, nos familles, de façon respectueuse. Merci.
Alors, merci à Mesdames Beaumont et Pepler pour ces commentaires. I was wondering before I open the floor to questions, did you want to add something or respond, Wayne, to what's been said, or you're happy to
I'm happy.
You're happy.
Nothing high quality, nothing I can add.
OK. So, alors, vous pouvez... La période des questions est ouverte. Je vous demanderais, ça serait vraiment bien si vous pouviez vous identifier lorsque vous posez une question. So if you could identify yourselves when you ask a question, that would be great. Or make a comment.
Hello there. My name's Corporal Stu Leach. I'm an RCMP member, and I'm with National Crime Prevention Service here in Ottawa. I'm the National School Action for Emergencies Coordinator for the RCMP, which is putting in place emergency response plans in schools, and that's for a Columbine-type scenario. That's been worked on for the past 6 years, and at present we're focusing more on prevention. And I just wanted to thank Wayne. Excellent presentation. And I'm glad that you mentioned about the desensitization issues. And that's what I wanted to mention. I wanted to mention a website. It's called www.killology.com. So you might want to make note of that and just have a look at it. And it's a website of an Army Ranger psychologist. His name is Colonel Dave Grossman. He's an expert on the psychology of killing. He's traveled all over the world training elite military units. He puts the fault for the violence we're seeing in our society today squarely on the doorstep of media and desensitization of our children through the repetition of violence in TV and movies, repeated exposure to that, by our children who are, at the toddler age and up. And this is a problem. It's an extreme problem in our society, and I fear for our society from that perspective. As long as that continues, our youth are desensitized to violence, and we're seeing them act out more and more in this fashion. So as long as we continue to support these types of extreme blood splatter type movies and turn on the TV and use the TV as a parenting tool, where our children at very early ages are seeing this extreme violence, then I don't understand how we can be surprised when they become teenagers at the behavior that we are seeing. So I think we as parents, as adults, need to stop supporting this type of behavior, these types of movies, this type of violence in being seen as entertainment. And I think that's a big problem. Our world has shrunk with technology. When we see a school attack or other extreme violence on the other side of the world presented to us in all its glorious color right in our faces within a matter of minutes today. These are, again, the media with the if it bleeds, it leads attitude. I think this is the root cause of a lot of the issues we're seeing today. And anyway, Colonel Grossman has an excellent site, a lot of good material in there. He's an author and who is promoting that we do stop supporting this type of entertainment, and it's www.killology.com. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll probably take a few questions and then let you respond if you wish so. Yes?
My name is David Millen. Excuse me. My question is not a simple one. If it was, it would have been addressed and answered a long time ago. The question is, when are we going to go beyond the rhetoric of youth and child engagement? From the time I was a youth myself, we're talking 50-odd years ago, I was concerned about youth engagement, bringing youth to the table. And here it is, now I'm an old man getting very jaded and cynical about the whole issue of youth engagement, to the point where, I'm quite happy to walk away from it all, because I keep hearing the same old, in terms of, we can bus them in, we can plane them in, we can fly them in, and have them sit at the table and speak for a little while, and then we old guys will go out and write the reports and write the recommendations and all that kind of stuff. And we continue to do it. But we talk the talk. And, so I'm not saying that this is an easy question. I think it's really difficult. What is youth engagement? And how do we come to grips with that dilemma in this very important issue? And the second point, tied in with youth engagement, is relating to children in schools. Why is it that so rarely do anti-bullying or prevention programs in this country bring the children's opinions to the forefront? I don't know of many bullying prevention programs where there are student discussions, where kids have the opportunity on a regular basis to sit and talk about friendship, respect, empathy. It just doesn't happen. Or if it does happen, it's by happenstance. So my question to the panel is, what is youth engagement? How do we go beyond the rhetoric of youth engagement? And where are the programs that engage students at the classroom level and seek out their opinions and recommendations?
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Virginia Caputo, and I'm here from Carleton. I wanted also to thank Wayne for setting us up with that overview, and especially for the point that this is a relational issue. And then to pick up on Deborah and perhaps the last question about youth engagement, I think it's so important that you put forward this notion that this is about a model of power. And so the question, and it's a big one, and I don't know how to answer it, so I'll defer to you, Deborah, is how do you change this model of power over to power to? And that has something to do with youth engagement. Part of it, Wayne, you alluded to the language. And so language like, let's give children a voice, has much to do with power over. Even that language has that embedded within it. So the question is, how do we change these hierarchical structures to enable a power to, or what kinds of models of power can we introduce to displace this notion of power over? And then my final point is, power is implicated in social lines of difference. And so what I would like to add to this discussion is that this is a deeply gendered experience. Gender, race, age, class, sexuality, ability. And I don't think we can continue a conversation if we don't have that, bring in that particular gendered lens, which implicates power. Thank you.
Thank you. Should we start? Wayne, Deborah, Claire, would you like to respond or comment?
All right, I'll try to keep my comments brief so we can get as much discussion. Just on the first point, desensitization, I couldn't agree more, obviously, based on what my presentation was. And I think, we do have to, as a society, really think about that. And obviously television and movies, but also social media, video games, on and on it goes. So I think that's really critical. So I certainly agree with that. And I think it is linked to other forms of violence, obviously, as well. The youth engagement point, really important point, and I agree with you, generally not well done. And I think there's a number of reasons. The power comment that followed that is part of the answer to that. It is kind of breaking it down. Not to say we did it perfectly, but we made some efforts on our task force to do that. Our 5-person task force had one youth representative, and the larger working group had a number of young people. We also tried to get representation from different groups, Aboriginal, racial minorities, gendered divisions, and so on. And the youth focus groups were really vital. And there is an excellent appendix, I think it's the first or second one, to the report online that is a summary of those youth focus groups, which largely is their voice, quoting and making comments, which I tried to integrate. So I absolutely agree with you, and we need to do more. I suppose the only other thing I'd say, in a peer-led restorative approaches has one of the best records on these kind of things. So there is some evidence out there. People are still reluctant, and they're reluctant primarily, I think, for the kind of reasons that the last questioner raised about the power and hierarchy, that it's not normally how we do things, and we have difficulty getting out of that box. And recommendations like having a youth advisory group advising government on important policy decisions has not been acted on, and they don't tend to get acted on. And in the human rights dimensions of these problems, critical that the victims are disproportionately vulnerable members, one of the most frequent, gendered or sexual orientation being particularly high, but you could name any vulnerable group. One of the reasons that human rights complaints are one good way to respond, because so often they are also human rights issues. So that's my comment.
Claire, est-ce que vous voulez rajouter quelque chose?
En fait, moi, je voudrais commenter concernant les programmes d'intervention dans les milieux scolaires. On demandait, comment ça se fait qu'il y a tellement de programmes qui ont été implantés, comment ça se fait qu'il y a encore tant de difficultés, et l'engagement n'est pas nécessairement au rendez-vous non plus. Mais je dirais d'abord que ce que la recherche a démontré, c'est qu'une équipe scolaire pourrait avoir un très, très beau programme d'intervention qui a été approuvé par la recherche et validé si la mobilisation du personnel et la mobilisation des adultes de l'école n'est pas au rendez-vous, ça va donner des résultats très médiocres. Donc, quand on évalue des programmes, on évalue aussi la mise en œuvre, c'est-à-dire comment les personnes ont mis le programme en place et aussi les résultats. Je dirais qu'il y a des programmes qui existent pour vraiment mobiliser et engager les enfants dans leur vie scolaire. Et on retrouve aussi que plus les enfants ont un sentiment d'appartenance à leur école, plus ils collaborent, plus ils sont impliqués dans les activités, plus on leur demande leur opinion aussi, plus ils sont sensibles justement à l'écoute qu'on leur donne, alors moins les comportements se produisent dans ces établissements-là. Dans les approches, j'appellerais ça plus des approches que des programmes pour mobiliser les jeunes, il y a tout ce qu'on appelle les systèmes de médiation par les pairs, où en plus d'apporter un soutien aux enfants qui ont des difficultés, ça permet à ceux qui agissent comme pères aidants de développer eux aussi leurs compétences sociales et de démontrer par les actions qu'ils mènent qu'ils sont importants pour les autres. Il y a aussi tout ce qui est l'apprentissage coopératif. Alors, tout à l'heure, je parlais de la formation des enseignants. Alors, à mon avis, c'est quelque chose qui est extrêmement déficitaire dans la formation initiale des enseignants. Tout ce qui est l'apprentissage de la collaboration, l'apprentissage de la résolution. Tu sais, on utilise la méthode scientifique pour régler un problème de mathématiques. Alors, la résolution de conflits, il y a aussi des étapes, il y a aussi des choses qu'on peut enseigner aux enfants et en très, très bas âge. Et ce sont des apprentissages qui ne sont pas non plus faits dans la plupart des facultés en éducation. Donc, je dirais, à la base, je reviens encore là-dessus, c'est peut-être un peu mon cheval de bataille, comme on dit, mais si on enseignait aux futurs enseignants à être des adultes, à être à l'écoute, à être capable d'écouter, l'écoute active, et à être présent et à observer. Si on leur aussi donnait des outils pour connaître l'enfant parce qu'ils connaissent la matière, ils connaissent peu le contexte. Quand on parle de pédagogie inclusive, c'est un concept qui est encore très, très mal compris. Donc, la pédagogie inclusive permettrait d'empêcher, en tout cas de diminuer les effets de l'exclusion que certains enfants peuvent vivre. Et aussi, en termes de formation, tout ce qui est approche collaborative entre collègues, parce qu'aussi dans les écoles, où les collègues, les profs, les enseignants et tout le personnel travaillent ensemble, il y a plus de chances qu'on soit dans un milieu où il y a moins de violence qui se passe parce qu'il y a plus de respect, il y a plus de collaboration, il y a plus d'échanges entre les personnes. C'est une longue réponse. Hein? J'avais même pas fini.
Vous aurez l'occasion plus tard de reprendre ces idées.
Let me just jump in and make a couple of other points. I agree that media violence is a huge problem. The complexity of the problem is that the children and youth who are most aggressive, who have most aggressive attitudes, are those who use that media more, who have friends that use that media more, and they're the ones that are most affected by that negative violence. And I feel a tension in depicting youth as these organisms that just suck up violence and take it in, because the vast majority of youth in our society are wonderful, wonderful people, which brings sort of us back to David Mill's point, how do we engage young people, because they are concerned, and I think they're more globally aware and more responsible in that way than I certainly was when I was growing up, because I didn't know about the world the way young people do. So I think we need to take a positive youth perspective and understand that the violence is out there, and it's our job to be sure that, youth don't see this as highly entertaining and don't see it as fitting into anything that's reality, because it's not. It's all fiction, and don't see it as a way of solving problems. And that brings me to the issues of power that you raised. And I just think this is so important, but it's it starts with each of us. Every person in this room has power by virtue of being an adult, by virtue of being well educated, by virtue of, of being who we are. And the challenge is figuring out how to use that power positively and how to use that power with and share the power that we have. And I think when we're working with children and youth, that's a real challenge for us. And I think that Claire's so clearly described how we need to educate teachers to share power. And I really think that UNICEF's Rights Respecting School program is an excellent mechanism for that. But there's not a lot of take-up and eagerness to say, let the children be involved. So I do think we have a lot to learn individually and then a lot to learn collectively from each other and from the youth.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to add? No, I'm feeling very torn because we really need to break. Did you want to just add, comment something?
Yes, I just want to make a quick point on the mechanism of desensitization, again, just how powerful it is. And on Colonel Grossman, he mentions, for example, during the Civil War, only 1 soldier in 10 was actually willing to kill. It's not natural for human beings to want to harm or kill each other. And 1 in 10, they've done studies on that. But the military of the day and since then have looked at that and said, this is not acceptable. We need our soldiers to be able to kill. And through the mechanism of repeated exposure to violence, by the time the Vietnam War rolled around, 9 in 10 were willing to kill. And the point is that Colonel Grossman makes the point that the same mechanisms used to train our soldiers are being affected against our youth today through violent blood splatter movies, sitting in the movie theater with the arm around the girlfriend, eating the pop, drinking the Slurpee, as we see this violence, and through the gaming, which desensitizes and conditions. So that's what we're up against today.
Est-ce que vous pensez pouvoir...
en quelques mots.
Pardon, rapidement.
Mon nom est Ryan Maëlé, je suis un étudiant de 2e année en droit civil et j'aurais une question pour Madame Leclerc. Vous avez beaucoup parlé de méthodes pédagogiques au niveau des enseignants et je me demandais est-ce qu'on ne pourrait pas, dans le fond, introduire ou bien pousser les enseignants à utiliser les médias sociaux pour justement prévenir l'intimidation, la cyberintimidation. Dans le fond, un exemple, ça serait de dire à un professeur de créer un compte Facebook ou bien de s'impliquer dans les médias sociaux. Comme ça, il pourrait voir ce qui se passe. Parce que généralement, le genre d'intimidation sont insidieuses. On ne peut pas vraiment les voir en classe. Puis les professeurs, même s'ils font un maximum pour sensibiliser les étudiants sur la situation, ils ne peuvent pas vraiment voir la situation vu que c'est plutôt au niveau privé que scolaire. Alors, est-ce que ça serait une bonne idée d'impliquer les médias sociaux dans la résolution du problème?
Je pourrais répondre à ça, ce que j'ai entendu, comment ça s'est passé avec certains enseignants qui l'ont fait, oui, avec des résultats positifs et des résultats plutôt négatifs. Okay? Ce que j'ai vu, ce sont avec une très bonne volonté des enseignants du primaire qui avaient des comptes Facebook avec leurs élèves, oui, de 3e et 4e année, alors qu'ils n'ont même pas l'âge, ces enfants-là, pour avoir un, oui, compte. Alors, la méconnaissance du fonctionnement de l'univers des médias sociaux par les enseignants fait en sorte qu'ils se mettent dans des situations parfois embêtantes. Ce qu'on me disait, c'est que au début, ils trouvaient ça intéressant de voir, dans la vie et tout ça, mais ça devenait extrêmement envahissant. Okay. Et le rôle de l'enseignant versus l'enfant dépassait les limites. Okay. Alors, c'était un peu l'aspect négatif. Par contre, l'aspect positif, c'est d'avoir peut-être un espace classe ou un espace où ils peuvent parler ensemble, oui, mais ailleurs que dans l'univers personnel. Ça, c'est des commentaires positifs que j'ai eus. Maintenant, l'éducation des futurs enseignants aux médias sociaux, c'est extrêmement important. C'est quelque chose qui n'existe pas beaucoup non plus. Et on apprend sur le tas, comme on dit, comme les parents aussi. On est un peu à la remorque de toute la nouvelle technologie où les enfants nous dépassent. Oui. Alors, c'est certain qu'une éducation à l'usage des médias aujourd'hui, pour suivre un peu les enfants où ils s'en vont, c'est nécessaire que les enseignants aient ça.
Oui.
Et même les parents aussi, parce qu'ils nous dépassent. Alors, je dirais, il faut faire attention à cet aspect-là d'aller dans les médias sociaux, sauf que pour rejoindre les enfants, aujourd'hui, ils sont dans l'ère électronique. Donc, peut-être qu'il pourrait être possible de créer d'autres espaces, classes, ou d'autres espaces pour permettre d'avoir des échanges. Mais il ne faut pas oublier, tout à l'heure, on disait, bon, c'est important, l'aspect humain de l'enseignant versus l'enfant, sauf qu'il y a aussi l'aspect enseignant versus élève qui ne doit pas trop dépasser les limites.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci. Merci à tous. And please join me in thanking the keynote speaker and respondents. Thank you. Alors, nous vous donnons exactement 10 minutes pour vous étirer, peut-être trouver une meilleure place dans la salle pour vous asseoir. And so we'll be starting again in exactly 10 minutes. Thanks.